He pulled his jacket tighter against the cold and kept walking, 10 miles of cracked pavement ahead and nothing but determination in his worn-out shoes. Cars flew past, but he never raised a hand for help. His pride wouldn't let him. What he didn't know was that someone was watching, and that every step was about to matter more than he could imagine. The apartment held its breath before dawn, the kind of thin winter quiet that sneaks under doors and sits on your shoulders. Ethan woke to it, not because an alarm insisted, but because nerves do their own waking. The small heater had coughed out last week and never recovered, so the air had a faint metallic chill that turned every exhale into a little cloud. He lay there one more second, listening for his daughter's soft, even breathing from the couch, and then swung his feet to the floor. Today was the day, the interview, the day he needed to be more than tired and hopeful. SD 111092. He padded to the kitchenette and ran water over his hands to wake them up, then checked the clock, counting backward from the bus schedules he already knew wouldn't help him. Public transit didn't move early enough to carry a man like him on a day like this. 10 miles stood between him and a chance at steady work, and 10 miles, he decided, were going to meet their match. He glanced at the sagging couch where Lily slept, the blanket kicked to her knees. One hand locked around her only stuffed toy as if it were a promise. "I'll be back for dinner," he whispered, not to wake her, just to hear the certainty out loud. SD 111092. Clothes mattered today, but choices were thin. He eased open the closet and pulled the best he had. Formal pants whose creases had long retired, and a shirt he had ironed days ago when hope felt like a plan. He smoothed the fabric across the bed, pressing with his palms where an iron couldn't go. The shoes waited by the door, worn leather, softened by years, and hurt by them too, little dark mouths opening where the soles had split. He thumbed the frayed laces like a ritual and then threaded them tight. "Hold together," he murmured, unsure whether he was talking to the shoes or himself. SD 111092. He wrote a note for Lily, big letters, a doodle of a smile, propping it near the cereal box she liked to pretend was a treasure chest. "Be good for me. Big hug when I'm back." He paused, pen hovering, and added a small heart she'd tease him about later. The memory of last night's math worksheet drifted in, Lily counting by twos, tongue between her teeth, while he pictured a future where homework happened at a kitchen table that didn't wobble. It was an ordinary dream that made it sacred. He thought of the last 2 years as weather, long, gray, and changeable only in how hard it rained. Stacking shelves at midnight until his forearms trembled, dragging a trash barrel across a parking lot that glittered with broken bottles, clocking out just in time to clock in somewhere else. The math had never worked, no matter how long he held the numbers in his hands and squeezed. But Lily's needs kept calibrating him. The new backpack she wanted because the zipper on the old one caught, sneakers without windows in the toes, a cup of ice cream eaten slowly on a park bench like a ceremony. He let those images cycle through him now, not to make himself brave, but to remember what bravery is for. He tore a slice of bread, ate it dry, and drank water straight from the tap. Hunger would be part of the walk, but hunger had been part of most things lately. He washed the cup, set it upside down, then stood for a moment with his hands on the edge of the sink, feeling the cool porcelain steady him. Interviews want confident men. He would bring quiet instead, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. At the door, he looked back. Lily had shifted, the stuffed toy pressed to her cheek, lashes dark against her skin. "Dad's got it," he said in the smallest breath. He locked the door with the care of someone closing a toolbox, not a home, and stepped into a hallway that smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. Outside, the streetlight made a small gold island around him. The sky was a deep, unreadable blue, and the air gnawed through the thin fabric at his wrists. He set off at a pace that wasn't fast. It couldn't be, not with shoes like these, but it was steady. The building's shadow gave way to the open road. The pavement scuffed and pitted, each seam catching the ball of his foot. He kept his eyes up, shoulders loose, the way you do when you intend to arrive and intend to look like you belong when you do. 1 mile in, his toes began to object. 2 miles in, the objections organized. He adjusted his gait, rolling through the heel to spare the split in the sole. Cars slid past, windows reflecting a piece of his shape and flinging it forward like a dare. A sedan slowed once. Curious, maybe, but picked up again without offering anything more. He didn't lift his hand. Help asked for is a debt. He couldn't afford any more of those. Pride wasn't a virtue right now. It was armor, and armor can be heavy and still be necessary. With the city still drowsy, his breath grew loud enough to braid into the morning noise. He counted steps in batches of 100, awarding himself a breath through the nose for every full set. When the wind came crosswise, he tucked his chin and pictured Lily again, hair a tangle, grin a lighthouse, asking for a story about a brave rabbit who always found the path home. He let the imagined cadence of his own voice carry him forward. Once there was, and then, and finally. He smiled despite the ache because the rabbit kept winning. Somewhere around the halfway mark, pain expanded into a geography with borders and rivers. He cataloged it calmly, the way he'd once learned to catalog warehouse stock. Left heel, sharp. Right big toe, hot. Calves, tight and noisy. He promised each complaint a bath later and let the promise be enough for now. The sun shouldered up from behind the low roofs, throwing long spoons of light across the road, and he stepped through them like a swimmer pulling the surface over his head. He didn't check the time again. Clocks could lie to you about what you had left. Distance tells the truth. 10 miles, he reminded himself. 10 miles is not a wall, it's a line. At the end of that line was a building with a reception desk that would have his name written in planned ink, and a room with 3 chairs that might hear his story. He felt the steadiness rise again, small, stubborn, serviceable, and leaned into it. When the skyline finally gathered itself in front of him, both feet were live wires. Sweat crawling down his back chilled in the morning air, and he had to blink to clear stinging salt from his eyes. He pressed a palm briefly to the glass of the lobby door before he opened it, leaving a faint, fogged print, evidence that he had reached something. The warmth inside hit like applause. He straightened his shirt, dragged his fingertips across the hollow of his throat to slow his pulse, and made himself walk, not stagger, to the reception desk. Ethan Miller. Interview at 9, he said, voice low but even, as if he hadn't just traded miles for minutes. The receptionist smiled, asked him to take a seat, and slid a visitor sticker across the counter. He placed it carefully on his chest, aligning the edges as if alignment itself could be lucky. When he sat, the chair side underneath him and his shoes, loyal to the last, decided to hold together just a little longer. He folded his hands to still them and breathed in the waiting room air, paper, coffee, cologne, preparing to speak the truest version of himself he could carry into a room. The city kept moving outside. Inside, Ethan was, for the first time today, still. The door of the apartment clicked shut behind him with a sound sharper than it should have been, like punctuation marking the end of one life and the uncertain start of another. The hallway light buzzed overhead, then went still as he descended the stairs. Outside, the street stretched in 2 directions, both empty, both waiting. Ethan adjusted the strap of his faded jacket, tugged it tighter across his chest, and started forward. He didn't look back at the apartment window. Looking back could break him before the walk even began. The city was hushed at that hour, a mix of street lamps and the faint stirrings of early traffic. Ethan's steps echoed hollowly at first, the soles of his shoes flapping against the pavement in an uneven rhythm. He tried to ignore the cold nibbling through the worn leather. 10 miles, that was the math. 10 miles of concrete and asphalt. 10 miles of keeping his mind steady enough to arrive with dignity instead of defeat. He kept his head up, though pride did little to soften the sting in his toes. His thoughts kept circling back to Lily. He pictured her waking later, rubbing sleep from her eyes, spotting the note he had left. Maybe she'd smile at the doodled heart and tease him about being too mushy. Maybe she'd pretend to be braver than she was, pouring cereal into her chipped bowl and turning on the cartoons that didn't quite drown out the silence of an empty apartment. Every step he took was meant to shorten that silence. By the second mile, the rhythm of walking became a test. His breath formed small clouds, dissolving quickly into the blue-tinged air. Cars began to pass, their headlights brushing against him like fleeting glances. Once, a sedan slowed and matched his pace for a beat too long. Ethan could feel the driver's curiosity, but he didn't lift his arm or nod for help. Pride had grown roots in him long ago. Accepting a ride now would feel like erasing the very fight he needed the interviewers to see written in him later. This wasn't a morning jog. This was a march. And it was his alone. By the fourth mile, pain had begun to take shape. It wasn't just a dull ache anymore. It was a personality, sharp in the left heel, hot in the ball of the right foot. Ethan adjusted his stride, rolling forward carefully. "Just keep moving," he muttered under his breath, each word pushing him a few more steps ahead. The rough pavement felt like sandpaper scraping the last threads of his determination, but his determination kept regenerating, fed by every image of Lily's smile. Halfway there, his legs burned as though someone had replaced his muscles with cords pulled too tight. He distracted himself by cataloging small details: the chipped paint on a telephone pole, a candy wrapper pinned against the curb by frost, the first slice of sun cutting a shadow from a rooftop across the road. He forced his mind to treat these as markers, proof that he was advancing even when his body screamed otherwise. At one point, he passed a convenience store just opening its doors. The smell of hot coffee drifted out, so warm it felt unfair. His stomach twisted in response, reminding him of the single dry slice of bread that had been breakfast. He turned his head away quickly, afraid that if he lingered, the yearning might paralyze him. Hunger was a companion he already knew too well, and it had never once stopped him from moving. Every car that sped by, every pedestrian who spared him no glance, became part of a silent audience. Ethan wondered how many of them could guess what 10 miles of pavement meant to him, that each blister swelling in his shoes wasn't a wound but a wager, a gamble for a life where Lily wouldn't have to clutch a threadbare toy for comfort at night. By the 8th mile, he had stopped measuring the distance in numbers. It had become something else, something heavier. His body was no longer asking if he could finish. It was asking what would be left of him when he did. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing his mind to remember Lily's small voice saying "Good night, Dad," before drifting off. He told himself that was enough. That was always enough. As the skyline of downtown rose slowly in the distance, Ethan lifted his chin, the sun brightening the sweat streaking his shirt. He could feel the shoes giving way beneath him, seams stretching and groaning, but he whispered again, "Hold together." The building he aimed for stood like a promise, glass windows glinting with the light of morning. 10 miles hadn't broken him. They had prepared him. And no matter how the interview went, he knew that by walking every step, he had already proven something to himself, that nothing, not even distance, hunger, or pain, was stronger than a father walking toward hope. Jonathan Hayes had left his mansion earlier than usual that morning, a habit born not of necessity, but of restlessness. Success had built him a home with gates that whispered luxury and silence that felt too heavy. Sometimes he rose before dawn, instructing his driver to take the long route into the city, as if watching the world wake up could remind him of something he'd lost along the climb. That was when he first saw Ethan. A man in a faded shirt and tie walked steadily along the side of the road, shoulders squared against the cold, shoes slapping unevenly against the pavement. Jonathan noticed the man's pace first, not hurried like someone late for a bus, not casual like someone out for a jog. It was deliberate, weighted with purpose. Jonathan leaned forward in the leather seat, narrowing his eyes. "Slow down," he told the driver. The car eased back, engine humming quietly. Jonathan studied the figure through the tinted glass. The man's clothes were neat but tired, pressed with effort rather than wealth. His back was straight, but the strain in his stride betrayed the distance already behind him. Sweat glistened at his collar despite the biting air. Jonathan felt an odd pull, a flicker of recognition. He knew that look, the mixture of desperation and iron determination. He had once carried it himself, back when his own shoes had holes and the weight of survival was heavier than any briefcase. "Sir," the driver muttered, glancing in the mirror. "Maybe he's just exercising." Morning joggers all looked serious. Jonathan shook his head slowly. "No, this isn't exercise. That man is walking with a purpose." His tone was quiet but final, the kind of certainty that came from more than observation. It came from memory. He remembered his own father's hands, calloused, cracked, blackened by years in factories, closing around a lunch pail every morning before sunrise. He remembered walking to school in patched shoes, cheeks burning as classmates pointed and laughed. And he remembered the promise he'd made as a boy, that if he ever built a life beyond those days, he would never forget what it took to survive them. That promise stirred now, watching the stranger's determined stride. For several miles, Jonathan instructed the driver to stay just far enough back. He didn't want to intrude, didn't want to announce his presence, but he couldn't look away either. The road unwound ahead, and the man walked as if each step were the only one that mattered. His pride was visible even from a distance. He didn't raise a hand at the passing cars, didn't pause to rest. He carried his dignity like a fragile but unbreakable package. Jonathan's chest tightened unexpectedly. Here he was, a man with every comfort, watching someone else shoulder the kind of fight he thought he'd long left behind. It humbled him, and it unsettled him. In boardrooms, numbers told him everything he needed to know about a person's worth: profit margins, growth rates, deliverables. But none of those numbers could explain why this man kept pushing forward with blistered shoes and a hunger-creased face. "Where do you think he's going?" the driver asked, more curious now. Jonathan's gaze remained locked on the figure. "To change something," he murmured. "You don't walk like that unless what waits at the end matters more than what it costs to get there." The driver said nothing after that. Silence settled in the car, broken only by the rhythmic slap of worn soles against the road and the steady hum of the engine shadowing behind. Jonathan didn't realize it yet, but a decision was already forming. This man, whoever he was, had just walked out of the anonymous crowd and into Jonathan's conscience. When the skyline finally appeared, Jonathan gestured for the car to speed ahead. He wanted to arrive first, to watch from the other side. As the man drew closer to the company building, Jonathan felt a strange anticipation. Numbers and resumes had built his empire, but today he suspected something else entirely might redefine it. By the time the glass towers of downtown finally rose above the thinning streets, Ethan's body felt like a map of complaints. His calves buzzed like wires stretched too tight, his back damp with sweat that the cold air refused to dry, and his shoes had surrendered into a chorus of creaks. Yet he kept his pace even, shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to suggest control. Appearances mattered now more than ever. If he stumbled into that building looking broken, no one would listen long enough to hear what he had to say. The company headquarters stood ahead, a modern building of steel and mirrored windows that caught the rising sun and bent it into brilliance. It looked nothing like the world he had walked from, yet it contained the possibility of everything he hoped to give his daughter. He paused briefly across the street, chest heaving, eyes tracing the length of the lobby windows. The reflection looking back at him was not flattering. Shirt clinging with damp, shoes scuffed into surrender. He straightened his collar, smoothed his sleeves, and whispered, "Just hold together a little longer." He pressed a hand against the cool glass door before pushing it open, leaving a faint fogged print behind, a mark of arrival. Inside, the warmth enveloped him instantly, a shock after miles of biting air. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish, the kind of subtle wealth that didn't need to announce itself. People in suits moved across the marble floor with clipped footsteps, badges swinging from their lanyards. Ethan felt the strangeness of it all, like stepping into someone else's life, but he forced his breathing to steady. At the reception desk, he gave his name in a voice low but firm. "Ethan Miller. Interview at 9. The receptionist smiled politely, checked the schedule, and slid a visitor sticker toward him. He pressed it onto his shirt with careful precision, aligning the edges as if neatness itself could tip the balance in his favor. The waiting room chairs lined one wall in perfect symmetry, upholstered in muted gray. Ethan lowered himself into one, legs grateful but restless. His shoes whispered their protest, but they had carried him this far, and he silently promised them rest after. His hands trembled faintly, so he laced them together, anchoring them in his lap. Hunger, sharp and insistent, twisted in his stomach. He had eaten only a dry slice of bread hours before, and now the scent of fresh coffee, drifting from somewhere down the hall, was almost cruel. He tried to push the sensation aside by thinking of Lily. He pictured her at the kitchen table, opening the note he had left, smiling at the clumsy heart. The thought steadied him. Other candidates arrived, brushing past him in crisp suits and polished shoes, their colognes trailing confidence. Ethan felt their eyes flick toward him, brief appraisals that stung but didn't surprise him. He sat straighter, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of comparison. What he lacked in polish, he carried in resolve. What Ethan did not know, what he could not know, was that the man who had watched him from the black sedan was already inside. Jonathan Hayes had taken a seat at the far end of the waiting area, dressed not as a distant CEO, but as a quiet observer. He watched Ethan's weary posture, the way he wiped his palms against his thighs to hide the tremor, the way he refused to bow his head, even when doubt must have pressed hard. For Ethan, time moved strangely. Minutes stretched into long, taut chords. Every click of the receptionist's keyboard, every shuffle of polished shoes against the floor, pulled at his nerves. He rehearsed answers silently, tried to keep his breath steady, tried not to think about the fact that he had walked 10 miles to sit in that chair. When at last his name was called, he rose carefully, as if standing too quickly might betray the ache in his legs. He squared his shoulders once more, drew a slow breath, and followed the assistant down the hallway. Behind him, the waiting room faded into silence, but inside his chest, his heart hammered like a drum announcing the beginning of something larger than himself. The hallway leading to the interview room stretched longer than it was, each step echoing louder than the last. Ethan kept his stride measured, though the ache in his legs urged him to limp. He passed framed photographs of machinery, workers in safety gear, and smiling employees posed at company picnics. They were meant to showcase culture, progress, success. To Ethan, they felt like a silent reminder. This place already belonged to people who fit in. He swallowed hard and reminded himself why he was there. For Lily. For the backpack she wanted, the shoes she needed, the ice cream she deserved. The assistant held open a door, and Ethan stepped into a conference room lit by soft overhead panels. At the long table sat 3 managers, clipboards neatly stacked in front of them. But what caught Ethan off guard was the 4th man, older, sharp-eyed, dressed in a tailored suit that somehow carried less flash than authority. Ethan didn't recognize Jonathan Hayes, the CEO of the company, though Jonathan had already spent the morning recognizing him. "Mr. Miller," one manager said, gesturing toward the empty chair. "Please have a seat." Ethan lowered himself carefully, willing his knees not to creak. He offered a small, polite smile that he hoped looked confident. Inside, nerves buzzed like static. The questions began without ceremony. "Tell us about your previous work experience." Ethan clasped his hands on the table to keep them steady. "I've worked in retail, stocking shelves, and in maintenance, cleaning lots and facilities. It's not glamorous work, but I've learned to be reliable, to work late hours, to take on whatever needs to be done." His voice was plain, but steady. Another manager leaned forward. "Why do you want to work here?" Ethan took a breath, his throat tightening. "Because I need stability. My daughter deserves it. I want to build something steady, not just for me, but for her. I don't want her to wonder if the lights will stay on or if there'll be food at the end of the week." His voice cracked slightly on daughter, and for a moment silence hung in the room. Ethan didn't apologize. Some truths shouldn't be smoothed over. The 3rd manager glanced at his notes. "What makes you think you're qualified for this role?" Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to his own hands, the calluses, the small scars. He lifted them again. "I can't offer fancy degrees or perfect resumes, but I can offer work ethic. I don't quit, even when it hurts. I showed up today because giving up isn't an option. I'll learn whatever I need to. I'll do whatever it takes." Jonathan sat quietly, watching. He saw the faint tremor in Ethan's fingers, the sheen of sweat still drying on his shirt, the shoes splitting at the seams. But what struck him most wasn't the fatigue. It was the restraint. Ethan didn't plead. He didn't beg. He answered honestly, with the dignity of a man who knew he had little but still refused to make himself small. The managers scribbled notes, their expressions neutral, but Jonathan's mind was already moving. He remembered the 10 miles, the quiet refusal to accept a ride, the determined pace. And now, here in the fluorescent light of a corporate room, that same determination lived in Ethan's words. The final question came. "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" Ethan blinked. He hadn't rehearsed for that one. His voice was softer when he answered. "I see myself as the father of a little girl who doesn't worry anymore. A girl who can dream bigger than I did. If that means I'm still here, working hard and earning her a better life, then that's where I see myself." The room went still again. One manager cleared his throat, shifted papers. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. We'll be in touch." Ethan rose, legs trembling not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of uncertainty. He nodded, offered a small, tired smile, and left the room. Behind him, Jonathan's gaze followed, not as a CEO assessing a candidate, but as a man witnessing courage disguised as humility. The door of the interview room shut softly behind him, muffling the scratch of pens and the shuffle of papers. Ethan exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. His legs ached, his back screamed, but the sharper pain was the hollow in his chest, the not knowing. He had answered as honestly as he could, laid out his truth in plain words, and left it in their hands. Now, stripped of questions and answers, all he had was silence. The waiting room looked different on his return, though nothing had changed. The chairs were still in their neat row, the receptionist still typing, the clock still nudging its way forward. But Ethan's eyes saw everything through the haze of fatigue. He collected his jacket slowly, careful not to let his hands shake. The visitor's badge peeled from his shirt with a faint rip, as if erasing his presence already. He placed it on the counter with quiet precision, murmured a thank you to the receptionist, and headed for the lobby doors. The moment the glass doors opened, cold air slapped against him, shocking him back into the reality of his walk. His body wanted to sag, to crumple, but he forced his shoulders square. He couldn't afford to look beaten, not even to himself. He stepped onto the pavement, shoes groaning with each movement, and began the long journey back. The streets had filled while he was inside. Cars surged in both directions now, honking, braking, accelerating. Men and women in crisp clothes hurried past, clutching coffee cups, speaking into phones. No one noticed him. No one knew that he had walked 10 miles before sunrise to sit in a room where his entire future had been distilled into a handful of questions. And maybe that was the hardest part, how invisible it all felt. Yet beneath the ache, a strange peace stirred. He had not lied, not pretended to be more polished than he was. He had shown them exactly who he was, a man trying, fighting, refusing to fold. That mattered, even if it didn't earn him the job. By the second mile back, the adrenaline of the interview had worn off. Hunger pressed hard against his ribs, sharper now, no longer ignorable. He imagined Lily waiting at home, eyes bright as she asked how it went. He rehearsed possible answers in his head. It went fine, sweetheart. We'll see. He knew he wouldn't tell her about the shoes, the sweat, the way his voice cracked when he said her name. Those were his burdens to carry, not hers. Halfway home, he passed the same convenience store from earlier. The smell of coffee was stronger now, the shelves inside stacked high with things he couldn't afford. He kept walking, jaw clenched, pride bracing him against temptation. The miles stretched on, each one heavier than the last. But in his chest, alongside the fatigue, a quieter voice spoke. You gave it everything. You didn't break. You showed up. That voice carried him, step after step, until the skyline disappeared behind him and the cracked sidewalks of his own neighborhood rose up to meet him again. By the time he reached the apartment door, his shirt clung to him like another weight. He stood for a moment with the key in his hand, gathering himself before stepping back into Lily's world. He wanted her to see strength, not exhaustion. Finally, he turned the lock and pushed the door open. The apartment smelled faintly of cereal and crayons. Lily looked up from the kitchen table, her face lighting when she saw him. Dad, she chirped, bouncing from her chair. Ethan caught her in his arms, hugging her tight despite the fire in his legs. How'd it go? She asked, voice small but eager. Ethan smiled down at her, smoothing her hair with a trembling hand. It went, he said softly. That's what matters. I gave it my best. Inside, uncertainty coiled like smoke, but holding her reminded him why even uncertainty was worth the fight. Evening draped itself across the apartment like a heavy blanket. The small kitchen smelled faintly of rice and beans simmering on the stove, the cheapest meal Ethan could stretch into 2 days. Lily sat at the table, humming softly while coloring in the margins of an old workbook, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Ethan stirred the pot, exhaustion pulling at him, but he kept his voice light when he asked, Want some extra beans tonight, kiddo? She giggled and nodded, as if beans were a treat. He had just set 2 chipped plates on the table when the knock came. Firm, decisive, not the kind of knock neighbors used when they came by to borrow sugar. Ethan froze, spoon midair. Very few people ever knocked on their door. His pulse spiked. Dad, Lily whispered, eyes wide. It's fine, he said quickly, though he wasn't sure. He wiped his hands on a towel, crossed the small living room, and opened the door. On the threshold stood a man Ethan didn't recognize at first. He was tall, dressed in casual clothes that somehow still carried an air of authority. Behind him, parked at the curb, a black car waited, its trunk half open with boxes visible inside. The stranger held one of those boxes now, filled to the brim with groceries. Real groceries, the kind Ethan hadn't bought in years. Fresh produce, milk, bread still in its paper wrap. "Mr. Miller?" the man said, his voice calm but carrying weight. Ethan's throat tightened. "Yes." The man extended the box slightly. "My name is Jonathan Hayes. I don't usually do this, but today I saw something I couldn't ignore." Confused, Ethan glanced from the groceries to the man's steady eyes. I don't understand." Jonathan's gaze softened, but his words remained firm. "This morning, I watched you walk 10 miles to get to an interview at my company. I was in the car that followed you for several miles. I saw the way you carried yourself, determined, steady, never asking for help. A man willing to walk that far for his child. That's the kind of man I want on my team." Ethan's knees nearly buckled. He gripped the edge of the doorframe, as if the weight of relief might pull him down. "Sir, you're hired," Jonathan said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "Not just for the position you applied for. I want you in management training. We need men like you. Men who don't quit, who fight for something bigger than themselves." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Tears blurred Ethan's vision, the words slow to land. Hired. Management training. A future he had been chasing for years, but never dared believe would come. Behind him, Lily peeked around his leg, clutching her stuffed toy, her eyes wide with curiosity. Jonathan bent down slightly, meeting her gaze with a warm smile. "Your dad," he told her softly, "just proved he's one of the bravest men I've ever met." Lily blinked, then looked up at Ethan with a proud grin that sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing through him. He knelt, pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she squealed. Into her hair he whispered, voice breaking, "We did it, baby. We finally did it." Jonathan straightened, handing over the box of groceries. "There are more in the car. Consider this a start. You'll have a lot to learn, Mr. Miller, but something tells me you already know the most important part, why you're doing it." Ethan could only nod, tears slipping freely now. Gratitude and disbelief tangled in his chest. The weight he had carried for years, heavy as stone, lifted just enough for him to breathe fully again. Jonathan gave a small nod, then turned toward the waiting car. As he walked back, he glanced once more at the little family framed in the doorway. A man, his daughter, and a promise finally breaking through the darkness. For a long moment after the car pulled away, Ethan stood in the doorway as though rooted there, the box of groceries heavy in his arms, Lily pressed against his side. The hum of the engine faded down the street until only the quiet of their neighborhood remained. Yet inside him, nothing was quiet. His heart thundered with disbelief, gratitude, and a rising hope that felt almost frightening in its size. He carried the box to the kitchen table and set it down, his hands trembling not from exhaustion now, but from release. Lily leaned over the edge, eyes widening as she peeked inside. Apples, oranges, pasta, real cereal with bright colors on the box. "Daddy," she whispered, as if afraid it might vanish if she spoke too loud. "This is like Christmas." Ethan's throat tightened. He ran a hand gently over her hair and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. Better than Christmas. This is a new start." He turned back to the door for a moment, still half expecting Jonathan to appear again, to tell him it had all been a mistake. But the street outside was empty, and in that emptiness lived something Ethan hadn't felt in years, security beginning to take shape. Dinner that night tasted different. The rice and beans still simmered on the stove, but beside them stood fresh bread, butter, and vegetables Lily eagerly helped wash. Ethan watched her chatter and laugh, her shoulders lighter, as if she too felt the shift in the air. He realized then that the job offer was only part of the gift. The larger gift was dignity restored, a chance to hold his head high without fear of the ground crumbling beneath him. After dinner, Lily curled up with her stuffed toy, eyelids drooping as Ethan read aloud from her favorite storybook. His voice wavered once, not from fatigue, but from emotion. The words blurred when he glanced at her peaceful face. She deserved every good thing in the world, and now, for the first time in a long time, he believed he might be able to give her some of them. When she finally drifted into sleep, Ethan sat quietly by the window. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance. The same city he had walked through that morning with nothing but determination to carry him. 10 miles of blistered feet had led not just to an interview, but to a doorway where his life had pivoted. He thought of Jonathan Hayes, the way he had spoken without condescension, the way he had seen Ethan not as a desperate man, but as a determined one. Jonathan had said Ethan's courage had changed something in him. That thought humbled Ethan deeply. To think that his struggle, invisible to so many, had been witnessed and honored. It felt like a quiet miracle. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning his forehead against the cool glass. The weight that had clung to his shoulders for years had loosened, replaced by a steadier burden, responsibility with hope beneath it. He whispered into the dark, "We did it, baby. We really did it." Behind him, Lily stirred in her sleep, mumbling something too soft to catch. Ethan smiled. Tomorrow, the world would still be difficult. There would be challenges, long hours, new lessons. But tonight, the ground beneath his feet felt solid. And for a man who had walked 10 miles on nothing but faith, that solidity was everything.